The survivors of the wrecked HMS Wager had split into different groups. Team Bulkeley had made their way through the Strait of Magellan, and what was left of them landed safely in Portuguese-held Rio Grande, Brazil. Team Cheap had tried and failed to round the Tres Montes Cape to get to Chiloé Island and was heading back to Wager Island to die, while Team Morris was planning an overland trip to Buenos Aires. And, of course, Commodore George Anson was still on his mission to capture that Manilla Galleon. Let's follow these unfortunate adventurers as each try to make their way back to England. I am Yvette, this is Deep Fried History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of the story of the HMS Wager, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. Hope you've enjoyed the 4 episodes so far. If you haven't seen them all, please check them out for context. This video was made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all. These are my allies. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. Team Cheap, who had given up on trying to round the Cape to go to Chiloé Island and beyond, searched Marines Bay for the 4 Marines they'd left behind. They didn't find them. All they found were a musket and some ammunition left on the beach. Sadly, they must have perished. Team Cheap split up to find food. They killed seals and boiled their meat, hopefully enough to last them until they returned to Wager Island. Surgeon Walter Elliot came across a cave-like space within the rocks that had obviously been worked on by humans. There might be someone or something inside, but Elliot's curiosity got the better of him, and he crawled into the low passage and ended up in a large chamber. Light came from a hole in the top, and there was a frame in the middle made of sticks. It was a tomb. He saw 5 or 6 mummified bodies, but when he looked closer, he noticed another row of bodies underneath. Was this a burial place for their chiefs? But they hadn't come across any settlements. In fact, they'd not seen any Indians since they left Wager Island, nor any signs of them. No extinguished fires, nor wigwams. The place was too inhospitable, even for them. Well, there was no food inside, so the surgeon decided not to do more investigating and left. Meanwhile, others also ventured a peek inside. They continued on their journey home, and in seriously nasty weather, they arrived at the Christmas Cove. They spent another miserable night sleeping on oars. When they first arrived here, they were full of hope and purpose, but now they were heading back, where they could expect only suffering and eventual death by starvation. When they made for the Duke of Montrose's island, a wave swamped them, and they had to use hands and hats to bail out the barge to keep her from sinking. But it took days before they reached Montrose Island. While this was a beautiful place, it offered only berries. They were stuck again for days, living on these berries and what was left of their seal. One of the men wanted to stay there. This place was at least as good as Wager Island to die on, but the others just pulled him along. During a third attempt to leave Montrose Island, a fog came over them and they had no sense of direction. They narrowly escaped the breakers by lowering the sail. Some were knocked down to the bottom of the boat where they nearly drowned. Captain Cheap was sure they were lost. However, they sailed into Redwood Cove. But the weather was dismal and they couldn't keep a fire so they could dry themselves. They had to move on or stay and starve. Team Cheap moved out the following morning after the weather had improved a little. They spent almost an entire day getting out of the cove, but they arrived on the next island before the night. They scavenged for shellfish. Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton had fallen ill and made a sorry excuse for a wigwam to lie in, but when they started a fire in front of the entrance, the smoke drove them out. So they called the place Smoke Cave. They discovered a canoe, which they decided to take with them to Wager Island. It might be useful as a fishing vessel. Team Cheap towed her astern of the barge until it sank, and they had to cut it loose. Team Bulkeley was in Rio Grande, Brazil. On February 1st, 1742, the Brigadier Governor of the island of St. Catherine arrived. The soldiers of the garrison thought he'd come to deliver their 20 months of back pay, but he hadn't, and now fights broke out among the men. While most Speedwellians remained on the longboat, the garrison's commandant gave Bulkeley the keys to a house next to his. The gunner invited Carpenter John Cummins, the master's mate John Jones and John Snow, Cooper John Young, and the surgeon of the land forces Vincent Oakley to come live with him. There was no bedding, but it was dry and warm, and after months of sleeping hard, they were quite content. They hoped all the leftover survivors of the HMS Wager were as comfortable as they were. They spoke too soon. Team Bulkeley discovered that there had been a violent insurrection of the Rio Grande soldiers a little before they arrived. The men kicked out the officers, assumed their positions, put on their uniforms, and threatened to overthrow the governor, whom they thought was the culprit, although he cunningly convinced them he was their friend and promised to take care of their back pay. He hadn't. And now, despite the promises he couldn't possibly deliver, after 3 days of full bellies, Team Bulkeley were put on rations, along with the soldiers, and were once again in danger of perishing by famine. A supply ship was expected any day now, but supplies for the 1,000 people still left in the town would run out in 10 days. Now the soldiers had to share their meager provisions with another 30 men. Bulkeley asked to get at least as much of a ration as the soldiers, and after throwing in a bit of charm, they were granted at least the same portion of bread, for which they were very grateful. Team Morris on the beach south of Buenos Aires lived off seal meat, of which there was plenty, and a spring nearby supplied them with fresh water. They honed their hunting skills and dried seal to bring with them on their trip to Buenos Aires. After about a month, they felt they had recovered enough to embark on the journey. Team Morris put the dried seal in a knapsack they'd made from seal skins and filled the seals' bladders with fresh water. They took their muskets and ammo and set out on their journey around the middle of February. Team Morris would remain close to the coast, looking for the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, or as they called it, River of Plate. But after 60 miles, they still hadn't found fresh water sources. The place was barren and dry, and it hadn't rained. They feared that if they continued, they'd run out of water. So they decided to return to their camp and wait for the rainy season and try again. Back on the beach, they built a sort of hut under a cliff near the seaside to protect themselves from the weather. They were going to have to wait it out for months. On February 10th, by their reckoning, Team Cheap set out from Smoke Cove and rowed into Cheap's Bay at 6 p.m. that evening. The men were all starved, having eaten nothing but seaweed for the past 3 days. They entered their town and found that one of their huts had been nailed shut. When they broke in, they found a large heap of iron and other materials carefully picked from the Wager wreck. These must have been Indians, but not Coescar, because they hadn't shown the slightest interest in metal. So these Indians were in contact with the Spanish and understood the value of iron they probably used for trade. They found some pieces of seal tossed in the bushes, putrid, rotten, stinking, but it was food. Next order of business was something the seamen had been fretting about for a while. They went to Mount Misery to bury the man who'd been murdered by the Mitchell gang when they just arrived on the island. Superstition told them that if they left the body unburied, the dead would come and haunt them. They believed this was the reason their expedition had failed. The weather worsened, and they could get neither shellfish nor seaweed. They lived on wild celery, which only upset their stomachs more and didn't still their hunger. Meanwhile, disagreements arose between Captain Cheap, John Byron, and Lieutenant Hamilton on the one hand, and Midshipman Alexander Campbell on the other, who hadn't forgiven them for withholding aid after the yawl got swamped. Then Byron heard whispers that some crewmen planned to designate one man they would kill so they could eat his flesh. They'd already eaten raw meat. In their minds, this was the next logical step. But Lieutenant Hamilton found a rotten piece of beef washed ashore some miles from the hut and, despite his own hunger, shared it equally with everyone. The midshipman then went beef hunting and found more. Still, 2 men died of starvation. And a Marine who'd fled into the woods after he'd stolen food was never seen again. In Rio Grande, the supply ship couldn't clear the bar to enter the harbor and had left for St. Catharines. The governor quickly sent a pilot to get her back and bring her in. Team Bulkeley gave the pilot a letter to be delivered to Captain George Murray of the Pearl with a Cliff's Notes version of what had happened, signed by all survivors. They needed to get out of there before the thing with the mutineers blew up, or they starved waiting for a supply ship to come in. Frustratingly, Lieutenant Robert Baines hadn't been seen by any of the Speedwellians. He was probably living it up at the governor's house, 2 miles inland. So Gunner Bulkeley went to see the lieutenant and brought most men with him. They wanted to leave now. The governor once more promised to get them out on the first available vessel, but Bulkeley figured they'd have to wait forever for that ship to arrive. It was their duty to help the Severn and the Pearl. Why hadn't the lieutenant sent a message to their captains by now? Well, a messenger cost £50, all his money. When Baines suggested to go to St. Catherine's himself on horseback, he was told it was impossible to go overland. Well, everyone could plainly see that was a lie. The brigadier from St. Catherine's had arrived overland, and every week messengers left Rio Grande and returned. They were at the king's expense while being out of service. They would go themselves. They were tough men who could take a tough journey after what they'd been through. The lieutenant now saw Bulkeley as a troublesome fellow, just as Captain Cheap had thought. But he promised to ask the governor. He didn't. And Team Bulkeley also didn't get provisions that day. What gives? Was the lieutenant bad-mouthing them? Bulkeley waited until night to receive a message. None came. The following morning the gunner sent another message, cussing Baines out for blackening their names and not getting them the horses and guides they requested. He wasn't asking for a favor. It was his duty to save the crew. The survivors were under threat, from a riot, from hunger, from lies. Get them some canvas, they'd take the Speedwell to Rio de Janeiro. If he failed to help, there'd be consequences. After reading the letter, the lieutenant raced over. The first time he'd come down to see them in 3 weeks. But most men were busy and asked to be excused. They were at the hospital to pick up and bury the body of carpenter's mate William Oram, who, despite having survived the journey, died in the hospital that day. Give the lieutenant their coldest regards and let him know that his staying away from them for so long was disgusting. The lieutenant promised he'd take care of it all. On the 15th day after the return of Team Cheap to Wager Island, the mystery about who had nailed the hut shot was resolved when some Indians arrived in 2 canoes. The men were surprised to see that the white people had returned. Among the men was a cacique of the Chono's tribe who lived in the neighborhood of Chiloé. He spoke Spanish with a thick accent and said his name was Martin and his servant's name was Emmanuel. Obviously, that's what the Spaniards called him, who'd also recognized him as the leader of the tribe because they'd given him a stick with a silver head. The story of the shipwreck had reached him through other tribes. Since metal was valuable to Indians who had dealings with the Spaniards, they'd come out to gather what iron they could. However, withholding anything, even a rusty nail from the Spanish governor, was a very dangerous offense, which is why they'd left it in place until he could carry it off and hide it. Team Cheap explicitly hadn't touched the hoard, wanting to show the Indians they could be trusted. Surgeon Walter Elliot spoke a little Spanish and was able to communicate with the cacique that they wanted to reach the Spanish settlements. Could they tell them, or better yet, show them the way? If they arrived, he could have the barge with everything in it. It took some persuasion, but the cacique agreed to those conditions. Now everyone got packed up to get going. Since they had very little, they were ready quickly. They were going to get to Chiloé and live to fight another day. But if they thought dying on Wager Island was bad, they were about to sail into a whole series of unfortunate adventures. On March 6, 1742, 13 HMS Wager survivors embarked on the barge on Wager Island, joined by the cacique Martin and his servant, or something, Emmanuel. But while they were getting on board, a marine stole a greatcoat from one of the men. He disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. On the first island, there was no food or drink, so they made a fire and slept. That same day in Rio Grande, despite the pleasant weather, the ship's supplies still hadn't arrived and the tensions ran high. No one had sent the ship, had they? Team Bulkeley were eager to reach St. Catherine overland. Captain Pemberton of the land forces joined them, despite the governor's warning that it would be a tough journey. He said that he had men on His Majesty's ship the Severn, and he was needed there. But just as they met up with the 6 guides, they received word that the ships from St. Catherine had arrived, so the overland trip was cancelled. Team Cheap was doing worse than ever. On their second night, they couldn't find a port and slept on their oars, suffering from the most extreme pangs of hunger. The following day, they arrived at the spot where Martin had left his wife and 2 children in a hut. They spent a few days gathering shellfish and then set out again with the family and Emmanuel. At 8 a.m., they started rowing up a fast-streaming river. They figured this was a shortcut, but hours later, they hadn't gotten anywhere. Meanwhile, seaman John Bosman collapsed for want of food. Every now and then, he shouted for something to eat. 2 or 3 mouthfuls would save his life. Everyone looked at Captain Cheap, who had boiled seal, but he refused to offer even a morsel of it. So hardened had they become at the sight of so familiar a scene. Midshipman John Byron fed Bosman a few dried shellfish from his pocket, but these bits of food only prolonged his suffering, until at last he was released by death. At 6 p.m., they gave up on going upriver and returned to their previous port, where they buried John Bosman in the sand. Byron wondered if only Cheap had given him something, just a little bit, but then again, giving anything to someone else could spell the death of himself. And still, Cheap did better than most in the food department. The Indian saw the captain like a boss and gave him everything. While he shared some with Surgeon Elliot, the only one he still liked, he gave not a crumb to anyone else. Perhaps he thought that if he did, the Indians would think less of him and no longer give him any, but the others eyed the captain with disgust. Midshipman Alexander Campbell warned the captain about the rumblings among the crew, but Cheap now accused Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton of trying to take command from him by riling up the folks against him. Martin and his family went seal hunting and left Emmanuel to show Team Cheap where to get shellfish. Everyone joined him, except for Surgeon Walter Elliot, who was very ill. The land was desolate, and moving among the trees was treacherous, not because of some wild animals, but because of all the swamps. The seamen returned to the barge before the officers. Elliot asked the crewmen to take the boat out a little and shoot him a seagull. They went out all right, taking Emmanuel as a guide, but they never came back. Dark thoughts emerged. Perhaps Martin had lured them to row upriver to the point of exhaustion so that his servant could steal the boat. Without the barge, they were in a truly wretched condition. No food, no arms, no ammunition, no fire, no clothing, except the few sad rags on their backs. They only had 1 gun but no ball, and the bit of powder they had they used to start a fire. Byron, mad about the whole situation, went looking for food when he thought he saw a canoe. He was imagining things, surely. Indians never ventured out in such rough seas. No, indeed, it was a canoe. Byron raced to tell the others what he'd seen. They quickly made signals with their hats, and then ripped up the rags they were wearing and tied them to a pole to make a flag, which they waved furiously. Finally, those in the canoe saw them and headed for a calmer stretch of shore. Captain Cheap and Byron rushed to meet them. It was Martin and his family. Neither Cheap nor Byron could speak Spanish, so they brought him to the surgeon, who was so ill he could hardly raise himself from the ground. When Martin heard that Emmanuel had left with the 6 men, he and his wife were now terrified the captain was going to kill them. They jumped up, ready to leave, but Team Cheap managed to calm them down. Still, Byron was given a gun to keep watch over the family, lest they slip away again. Then, a few days later, Emmanuel returned. He said he'd escaped from the others when they entered a bay west of the island, but was this even the truth? The following morning, Captain Cheap, Lieutenant Hamilton and Surgeon Elliot, who was so weak the others had to carry him, joined Byron, who'd been watching over the family. What should they do now? They agreed to haul Martin's canoe, which could only carry 4 people overland, so he could visit some Indians who could help take Team Cheap to Chiloé Island. Captain Cheap and Midshipman Byron joined him, as Martin left his wife and children as pledges, ensuring he would return. With the barge no longer in the bargain, they promised Martin Byron's fowling gun and a few of the captain's things. Byron had to row all day, not having eaten much for 2 days. At the evening of the 2nd day, they discovered some 7 wigwams on an island. Byron wouldn't have lasted another day. As soon as they landed, Martin took Captain Cheap with him to a wigwam, but Byron had to fend for himself. The midshipman didn't want to intrude on the Indians there, worrying they might become angry, but he decided to chance it. He crawled into a wigwam and found a young and an older woman who were stunned to see him invite himself to sit by their fire. They stared at him for a while, and then they went out. Byron sat by the fire, drying what was left of his clothes. The midshipman figured any moment now some men would drag him out, or worse. But the women returned. They must have talked to Martin because they were laughing and chatting. They went to get some firewood, and Byron, starving, dared to ask them for food. Luckily, they understood what he meant, pulled out a fish from under some bark, which they broiled on the fire, and then signed for him to eat it. They didn't have to sign him twice. He devoured the fish so fast that he hoped they understood he was ready for another, but they had no more. Then the women put some dry leaves on the ground and made signs for Byron to lie down and sleep. A few hours later, he woke up with a blanket over him. The food he'd eaten made his hunger worse, and Byron made the women understand he needed more. They promptly headed out and returned an hour later, dripping wet, shivering with cold. They had caught 2 fish, which they prepared, and gave the midshipmen the largest share. Then they all went to sleep. On March 19, 1742, 4 vessels from Rio de Janeiro arrived in Rio Grande. They brought word that the Severn and the Pearl had left for Barbados a few weeks earlier. So much for that plan. These ships brought money, provisions, and, more importantly, the King of Portugal's pardon for all those involved in the mutiny. But only if they returned to allegiance and reinstated the officers they had riotously deposed. After an official pardoning ceremony, most men were still angry they hadn't received all their arrears. But once the commandant stepped down from power, everyone fell in line quickly and became private men again. Rank and order were restored. On March 24, 1742, Midshipman Byron and the women finally met up with the Indian men. The 2 women received severe punishment for apparently having entertained Byron. He felt guilty but didn't dare interfere in the beatings, lest he'd make it worse. But the Chono agreed to help them get to Chiloé. Meanwhile, Surgeon Elliot was doing badly and told Midshipman Campbell he was not long for this world. He granted him his watch in his will. Both Hamilton and Campbell were near death from starvation. Martin's wife didn't seem to care whether the men lived or died and refused to help them much. While they had to do the hard labor, Martin only gave what little he had to spare to the captain, who just sat there. The cacique also invited Cheap into the warm wigwam, while the others froze outside. It seemed Cheap no longer cared about any of them. When the other Chono caught up with them, they gave them a little seal and hunted for birds, food which filled them right up again. The survivors were grateful, but they were treated as slaves, or were simply ignored. The Indians and the Wager survivors got into the canoes, but they separated the white folk, no 2 in the same boat. Lieutenant Hamilton couldn't row, Captain Cheap wasn't expected to row, the surgeon was more dead than alive, laying at the bottom of the canoe. Only Midshipman Campbell and Byron could row. But it was clear Campbell was too weak, so he was giving bailing duty. The wind was tricky, and they soon landed again, only a small distance away. Here, Walter Elliot, surgeon of His Majesty's ship the Wager, departed his miserable life, dying to death as many others before him, being quite starved. For a long time, he seemed to be the strongest of them all. They scraped a hole for him in the sand, and buried him as well as they could. 2 days later, Team Cheap and the Chono left again, crossing a great bay to a mouth of a river. It was so shallow that the Indians took everything out of their canoes and carried it overland into a broad river the following day. So, this was the alternate route, overland. Their suspicions were confirmed. They would never have been able to carry the barge. The Cheap 4 were a sorry sight, enduring hardship after hardship. Their bodies were emaciated, with hunger inside and covered in vermin, lice, fleas, and other bugs on the outside. Their shirts were rotting off, and no one had shoes or socks. Every day they moved up the twisty river, battling upstream, and every night they slept under the most miserable conditions, in swamps, on hard rock, in the rain, with no cover and no food. The Chono had seal, but shared nothing with the men, who were stuck eating leaves, that the Indians called pange, which tasted disgusting. One day, during an overland hike, the captain needed to be supported during his walk through the swamp. Cheap had Byron carry his bit of rotting seal wrapped in canvas. The midshipman got his feet cut up from the submerged tree trunks and rocks and was too exhausted to carry it all the way. During a particularly melancholy moment, he stored it. When he found the captain was mightily displeased, Byron went back to retrieve it for him. This was insanity. Then, as everyone embarked again, Byron was left behind. Apparently others would come and take him. He found them in the woods further inland. Byron suffered so much from the cold that he tried to get close to the fire, a massive cultural faux pas. Byron was beaten and pushed away, but he ended up close enough to the fire so he wouldn't freeze to death. He made other cultural errors, some that nearly got him killed, but they did save him from eating poisonous berries. On March 31, 1742, Team Bulkeley set sail to Rio de Janeiro. This iteration of Team Bulkeley was Gunner John Bulkeley, Carpenter John Cummins, Marine Surgeon Vincent Oakley, the two master's mates John Jones and John Snow, Boatswain John King, Cooper John Young, and 6 seamen. Lieutenant Baines had already left without them. After a 2-day stop in St. Sebastian, they arrived in the great city of Rio de Janeiro on April 12th at 8 a.m. The following morning, they were ordered to come before the Portuguese governor, Mr. Rove, who brought in an interpreter, a Dutch surgeon who spoke English very well. The governor listened to the amazing tale of survival, but noticed obvious tensions between the gunner and the lieutenant, and the boatswain looked like trouble. They were his guests, and he gave them an allowance, but warned them he didn't want them to cause any trouble. No feuds, no quarrels among them, please. He put the surgeon as their consul in charge of finding them accommodation. The man found them a magnificent mansion. The governor sent over utensils, cutlery, benches, a table, candles, and the like. The boatswain, who considered himself the senior officer in charge, kept kicking up a storm about the allowance, how it was distributed, and who got what. But nothing seemed to satisfy him. The consul, being a very direct Dutchman, told off the boatswain with his turbulent temper. They either accepted what was given to them or they'd get nothing. The gunner, carpenter, and cooper asked the consul if they could rent another house because they couldn't guarantee peace if they stayed together. But the boatswain agreed to live with the private men, away from the 3 pirates as he started calling the officers. One day, the trio locked the 2 doors to their room and went for a stroll in the countryside. But when they returned that evening, they found the doors broken open, and Bulkeley's small sword in pieces. That had to be Boatswain King's doing. He was looking for something. The journal, filled with all the details, no doubt. Then the boatswain sent over his 2 bunk buddies, Richard East and an Irishman, to cause more trouble. Things came to blows, and the carpenter called the guards. The Irishman got away, but East was arrested along with Gunner Bulkeley, who was released soon after. When he returned to the house, he found the boatswain and 2 of his buddies attacking the cooper and the carpenter. The pirates thought they would die. As they were in no shape to defend themselves, they quickly left the house to prevent murder. The following morning, the consul expressed shock that a group of fellow countrymen who had survived so much misfortune, being in a strange land, would treat each other that way. The boatswain again flew into a rage, calling the officers rogues, villains, and pirates. So much for not causing any trouble. The trio asked the consul to rent a house in the country for themselves. The consul, seeing the raging toddler, agreed to separate them and got the gunner, the carpenter, the surgeon, the 2 mates, the cooper, and a seaman a house 2 miles away at a fishing village. Now they were at peace at last. Well, not so fast. In the afternoon, the reduced Team Bulkeley got a visit. Not from the boatswain, but from 3 of his trusty Trojans, 2 of the boatswain's friends, who had recently deserted from His Majesty's service, and an Irish clerk. They asked rudely, why did they move away? And they demanded a peek into Bulkeley's highly detailed journal. Bulkeley was about to explode, but found his inner zen for the sake of everyone around, and said he had no intention to comply. The journal was no secret, but he wouldn't part with it until he had copies made. He now feared for his life. This place was home to many a ruffian who for a few bucks could be hired for murder. They drank a glass together, and then the men left. Finally, some peace. Well, no. A few hours later, near midnight, the 3 men returned, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. Team Bulkeley would do no such thing. They weren't expecting company, and it was an improper season of the night. They should come back tomorrow. But the trio insisted that they open the door, saying that it would be better to do so than to be taken away in 3 hours' time. But they left. What did that even mean? Were these guys gonna come back with some friends and besiege the place? Unwilling to wait the outcome, the men jumped over a back wall and remained in the fields until sunrise. The following morning, they told the consul what had happened. He agreed. They were in danger and should leave Rio de Janeiro at once. Meanwhile, he gave them a new secret home, and they handed the journal and papers to a neighbor who offered to stand by them with his life. 2 days later, the consul arranged passage to Bahia and Lisbon for the gunner, the carpenter, and the cooper. The captain of the St. Tubes, Theophilus Orrego Ferrara, agreed, but they needed a pass from the governor, and they had to work to pay for their passage. They readily agreed. They received their passes 2 weeks later. The trio couldn't wait to get to sailing and get away from the devious bosun. Team Anson was still trying to capture the fabled Manilla Galleon. While the crew had thought the plan was near perfect, the execution was flawed to the point that the crew no longer believed it possible. On January 17, 1742, they arrived near Acapulco, but the chances of them encountering the galleon were small. They hoped she was also delayed because of the weather. They followed a light for days, thinking it was the galleon. It wasn't. It was a fire ashore high on the mountain. Was that for agriculture, maybe? But the prisoners they still had on board told them the galleon sometimes arrived in the middle of February. If she was late coming in, those fires were meant to guide her in. So, she may not have come in yet. They spread out the fleet, making sure they'd catch her as she arrived. But after several days, they wondered, maybe the Manilla Galleon had come in. On February 6th, the Commodore sent a barge to check the harbor of Acapulco. They captured 3 black fishermen who told them the galleon had arrived 1.5 months ago, before they even got into the area. But she was getting ready to depart in March. This was better news. The inbound Manilla Galleon mostly carried spices. While valuable, these were useless to the squadron since they spoil quickly. An outbound galleon, however, would have gold and silver to buy those spices in the Philippines. Their payday would be a lot bigger. But after they burned the Paita settlement, the governor of Acapulco was ready for them. In fact, Team Anson didn't know it, but they had seen the barge looking for the harbor, and they were on high alert. Meanwhile, Anson ordered the ship scrubbed, the rigging upgraded, and did extra drills to get his men prepped and ready to seize the outbound Manilla Galleon. When the time drew near, they set up a blockade, spacing the ships 24 miles wide. But they waited, and no ship sailed. The governor, knowing the English were there, stopped the galleon from sailing until next year. But several merchants didn't agree. Witnesses from Paita told them there were only 300 Englishmen. They could easily beat them. But it was deemed too risky, so no ship would sail. Commodore Anson realized a surprise attack on Acapulco like he'd done at Paita was out of the question. So, after victualling in Chiquetan, the squadron went on their 2-month journey to Canton in China to capture the Manilla Galleon there. Not after first drawing a map of Acapulco harbor for future reference and stripping the Carmine, Carmelo and the Trials prize for anything useful, and then scuttling all 3. They also released 56 prisoners. Some wished to stay on board to work. For 3 months, Team Morris had kept themselves alive at their beach camp, living off the food they caught. They brought something home every night and always had a hot meal. But they could only find seal and armadillo that behaved like a turtle, had a hard shell like a turtle, and tasted like a turtle. They got their firewood from a little forest 7 miles away. Nothing remarkable happened during this time, passing the time as cheerfully as those in their circumstances could. This was not a place they could live indefinitely. And even if they saw a ship passing by, any vessel who tried to moor there would wreck. They finally moved out again at the end of May, following the same route, hugging the coast with their usual stock of meat and water to find Rio de la Plata. They feared that if they ventured inland, they might encounter folk who were not friendly, or they might get lost and never be able to make it back to their humble abode again if they were forced to. 3 days later, they traveled about 70 miles. But at night, a violent storm broke out, with rain, thunder, and lightning, and it lasted all night. They were in open country and couldn't find shelter. They had nothing to cover them but a sealskin jacket and were half dead with cold. Not having found any provisions underway, they feared they'd run out. If they went further, it would only lengthen their journey back to the beach. The group had been harmonious up to this point, but now disagreement arose. Some wanted to continue on, but with difficulty they were persuaded not to split up. They returned to their hut once more. At last, Midshipman Byron was reunited with Team Cheap. Well, the Cheap Three, but no one was in any mood to celebrate their reunion. Marine Lieutenant Hamilton had had enough of the group and went off with his guide, so only Campbell and Byron were available to row with Martin and Emmanuel in a canoe that required 6 to row, and the midshipmen were in no shape to row. They could hardly stand, but row they must if they wanted to survive, and so they did. Martin's wife gave them the smallest portion of food, even though they worked the hardest. After working like galley slaves all day, they still had to walk miles to find shellfish at night. Their bodies were so emaciated that they hardly appeared the figures of men. And after the shortest of breaks, they were ordered back in the canoe again, rowing all night without landing. Finally, they got to a small island just southeast of Chiloé, and they had to wait for a fair wind. They beat their half-rotten clothes on the rock to kill the multitude of bugs that were crawling all over them. The feeling was worse than the hunger they felt. The long-bearded captain was worse off. Byron compared his body to nothing but an anthill, with thousands of those insects crawling over it, for he was now past attempting to rid himself in the least from this torment, as he had quite lost himself, not recollecting our names that were about him, or even his own. While they were inching their way forward towards Chiloé, they met other Indians who spoke a different language than the Chono. They described a ship on the coast with a red flag, an English vessel then. Perhaps Commodore Anson's squadron had made it after all. They also said that an Indian family had been held prisoner, but then they escaped. But they had been treated very well. So, that was the Anapink. In June they prepared to cross the bay to Chiloé, the very thought of which seemed to frighten their cacique out of his senses. It was a dangerous sea out there for an open boat, but even more so for a canoe. Finally, after crossing himself for an hour, he went for it. They'd made a sail out of bits of blanket, and the passage was terrible. The bottom plank of the canoe was split, which opened with every wave, and water continually rushed over the gunwale. They bailed like mad all the way over. Close to the shore, they nearly got caught in the breakers, but the young sailors managed to get the vessel on land. Once more they thanked God for saving them, as he had done from every danger they'd faced before. Chiloé was inhabited both by Indians and Spaniards, though part of it was uninhabited. On May 20th in the evening, Gunner Bulkeley, Carpenter Cummins and Cooper Young boarded the 28-gun St. Tubes bound for Bahia and Lisbon. The following morning, Captain Ferrara came on board. A Spanish Don returning to Europe was none too pleased to be on the same ship as 3 Englishmen. He told the captain to put them back on shore immediately. Oh no, not this. Not when they were so close. But the captain shut the Don down real quick. Lord or no, he was not the commander of this here vessel. He was a passenger, just like the men he so despised. The Don piped down, and when he heard their story and their string of misfortunes, he took pity on the men. He gave them food from his own table, calmed their hearts with liquor, and often said something heartfelt and comforting. On May 27, 1742, the St. Tubes anchored before the city of Bahia, today's Salvador. The trio went ashore to meet the viceroy, André de Meo y Castro, the Count of Gaveias, and showed him the pass they'd received from the governor of Rio de Janeiro. He told them the pass was for Lisbon, so they'd sail out on the ship they came in on. When they asked him for provisions or a little pocket money, he said no. Not even the captain, who interceded on their behalf, could persuade him. They didn't ask for much, just enough not to starve. Nope. Bulkeley said they'd be treated better as prisoners of the King of Spain than as distressed sailors in the care of the King of Portugal, because then at least they'd get bread and water. But the viceroy said he only had orders to take care of the French, no directives on the English. So now the men worked for their victuals, and only got 1 meal a day, bread and beans. But the St. Tubes wouldn't sail for Lisbon for another 6 months. Team Morris returned to their old quarters, realizing they should prepare for winter and get food, till it should please God one way or another to deliver us out of this melancholy situation. To avoid any disputes, they split up into 2 teams, which would take turns hunting for food for all of them. They made an oath they would never leave each other unless a superior force made them. They hadn't seen footprints anywhere, but Indians had to be around somewhere. The seals had realized what threat they were and became quite shy. Besides, they'd eaten so much that they were fed up with seal meat, but they had nothing else. Then they came across a large group of wild dogs, but they could never get close enough to kill them. Every now and then they had a puppy for a palate cleanser. They also saw deer, but had no way to take them. Then one day they came across a litter of 2-month-old puppies sheltered in a hole in one of the sand hills. They found 13 more and figured they would train them to hunt for them. Now each had 2 fiercely loyal dogs who helped them kill deer and wild hogs. They kept a boar and a sow for breeding. And the hogs and dogs stayed with them in the hut, which had turned into quite a home. But they had no salt to cure the meats, and there was not enough sun to dry them. And the winter brought so many storms with heavy rain that sometimes they couldn't leave the hut. The cheap trio had safely landed on Chiloé. The cacique quickly buried all the pieces of metal from the wager to hide them from the Spaniards. But now it started snowing, and they nearly froze to death. June was in the depths of winter in this part of the world. At about 9 p.m., the travelers were overjoyed to see something like a house which belonged to a friend of Martin, an Indian who lived with the Spaniards. They arrived in the dark. Martin made Campbell load Byron's fowling piece, and with 1 charge of gunpowder left, showed him how to hold it, and, holding it far from his head, fired it. He immediately fell back in his canoe. At the sound of the gun, the Indians ran out of the hut into the woods, scared out of their minds. Finally, the bravest among them got on a hill and yelled, "Were they Christians?" They were served a quick meal in the canoe, dried fish, broth and potatoes, all they had. But for the survivors, it was the best meal they had in months. When they were done, they rode about 2 miles further to a little village. The cacique woke one of the Indians up, who invited them in and made a large fire. They made beds of sheepskin close to the fire for Captain Cheap. He was so close to death's door that he wouldn't have lasted another few leagues. It was around midnight, and the Indian had no provisions in the house except some barley flour that they immediately turned into bread. The men, who hadn't had bread in so long, thought it was the best they'd ever eaten in their lives. Some of the men went out and killed some sheep, which they turned into a broth. It was served with eggs and potatoes. The following day, all the Indians came to see them, filled with compassion. They tried to outdo each other in who could take the most care of them, and the cheap trio ate and drank all day. But the natives couldn't give them clothes, having few for themselves. They had sent a messenger to the Spanish corregidore at Castro, a town much further north, to tell them of their arrival. A corregidore, or alcalde mayor, was a local royal official in the Spanish Empire. 3 days later, the messenger returned with the order to bring them to a station where the soldiers would pick them up. The Indians feared what would happen once they went to the Spaniards. What country were they from? Up to this point, whenever the Indians asked whether they were Dutch, French, or English, the only countries they heard of besides Spain, they answered they were from Grande Bretagne, a country unfamiliar to them. The men feared that if anyone found out they were English, who were at war with Spain, they wouldn't have taken them to Chiloé. This time they told them they were English, and at war with the Spaniards, which made the natives even more fond of them. And if they had dared to defy the Spaniards, they would have concealed them, so that no harm would come to them. The cheap trio reached the Spanish station. The station was a few huts with officers and soldiers who all had their swords drawn, as if these helpless wretches were some formidable enemy. They could hardly stand. The cheap trio stayed imprisoned in a shed under strict guard, but the locals still brought them food. Then a Jesuit from Castro came to see them. This wasn't a compassion visit, but a plunder visit. What valuables were they carrying? Cheap, preferring to remain friendly with the Spaniards, made Campbell surrender Surgeon Elliott's watch while concealing his own. Campbell did get some clothes in return. The cheap trio were taken to Castro in a large canoe-like boat at night, so they couldn't get a good look at the town. On their arrival, soldiers stood at attention, pretending to be busy with handing over the keys to the city as though it was a well-defended place with forts, city walls, and gates and everything. On their steep climb up the hill, the road was lined with soldiers who stood at attention with a lighted match, but not holding muskets, just broomsticks. The farce was complete when the cheap trio couldn't see gates, nor walls, nor anything that resembled a garrison. When they entered the corregidore's house, it was full of people. The corregidore was an old, tall man, holding a huge spado, a longsword by his side. He received them with great pomp, but without an interpreter, the survivors had no idea what the man was asking them. They served an excellent supper of cold ham and fowl and fine wine, and scarfed down what 10 men with a normal appetite would have eaten. It was a miracle they didn't die on the spot. Their hunger was so intense and continued for months after, with them sneaking food into their pockets so they could eat at night. The corregidore, soldiers and locals accompanied the cheap three to the Jesuits' college, where he asked the Father Provincial to see what religion these men had. They were given a cell with 2 beds and clean sheets, one for the captain, the other for Campbell and Byron. It was to be their prison until the governor, who lived in Sacau, some 160 miles north, called for them. They were each given an old clean shirt. They were so happy that they burned their old shirts, or rather rags, the following morning. Die, bugs, die. There were only 4 Jesuits in this massive building, and the following morning Captain Cheap was sent for by the father. They conversed in Latin, which neither mastered, but managed to understand each other. So, they were heretics, aka Protestants. Cheap understood that the Jesuits wanted to take all their valuables, which the captain told everyone to surrender. Naturally, he held on to his own valuables. On the night of the 8th day, they heard a violent knocking on the gate. A young officer rushed in to tell them that his father, the governor, had ordered him to take them to Sacau. The journey first went across land, and then they embarked on large canoes, and most of the soldiers got in them. The others took all their horses up overland. They arrived at a bay near Sacau 3 days later. Again, the same song and dance. They had to wait until dark before they could enter the town. Again, they were marched along rows of soldiers, some of whom had actual matchlocks. The cheap trio were taken to Palacio del Rey, the king's palace, the governor's house, which sounded very impressive, but was just a large thatched barn partitioned into several rooms. The governor received them in all his glory, sitting at the head of a great table covered with red baize and his principal officers standing by him. After some time, he had them sit down at the table. The governor used a linguist, an Englishman from Falmouth, an old buccaneer, to talk to them. But Byron felt the man could speak neither English nor Spanish. They were given an apartment, or rather a woodshed, but at least they had a roof over their heads. That's all that mattered. They were initially guarded by a soldier holding a sword in his hand, but he was removed a week later, and eventually they could move freely about town. That's how they found out the place only had a small earthen fort with a ditch, palisade, and cannons without carriages that couldn't defend the harbor at all. They dined with the governor, but the locals also fed them. Despite the good meals, they remained hungry for months. If the residents of Sacau were lucky, once a year a ship arrived from Lima to bring them supplies such as cloth, hats, sugar, brandy, and the like. Sometimes smaller ships came, but it was anyone's guess when those arrived. The ship hadn't come for a year, because of Commodore Anson's threat. The governor sent Indians to find the Wager wreck, the barge, and bring Lieutenant Hamilton with them. He promised to return the barge to the English. The Indians found it, and there were 2 men in her. Another 4 had starved after the 6 had left the cheap 7. The governor didn't return the barge. Team Anson was well underway to China when at the end of June, the Gloucester sprang her mainmast. It was so rotten and decayed that it could no longer carry sail, slowing her and everyone else down, adding another month to their journey. And, toward the end of June, scurvy hit again. By the end of July, the Gloucester was a wreck and was towed for a while as they tried to repair her. When a storm broke, she lost 2 masts and had 7 feet of water in her hold, despite their pumping water round the clock. With so many sick, 16 men and 11 boys ran the ship, and even some of those were ill. The ship was considered lost, and all crew and salvageable goods were taken aboard the Centurion. On August 15, 1742, the decision was made to burn the Gloucester lest she fall into enemy hands. She burned the entire night, a most horrid appearance, and the moment the flames reached them, her guns fired successively. At 6 a.m. the following morning, the Gloucester exploded. The small blast shot up a massive black pillar of smoke into the air. Thus perished His Majesty's ship, the Gloucester. A storm blew them off course and they were close to the Ladrones. Every day they buried 8 to 10 men until only 227 were left. The Centurion needed 700 to manage. It had been over 7 months since the longboat left Team Morris stranded on the coast. Winter was brutal and they divided into 4 shifts. 6 stayed home to keep the fire burning and prepare meals for the trip, while the other 2 went out looking for food. One night, a violent thunderstorm dislodged a part of a cliff which dropped onto their hut. Everyone escaped with their lives, but now they had to rebuild the hut. Off they went to the woods to chop down some poles with the one hatchet they had. The rest collected the materials. After a while, Joseph Clinch came running out of the woods crying, "Lord have mercy upon us, there is a great tiger!" This tiger was probably a jaguar. Team Morris was shocked. They'd never seen any sign, no paw print of any beast, so they hadn't brought their guns. They started running, but it came after them, and it was catching up. When it was some 20 yards away, they realized they couldn't escape it, so they turned around, clapped, hollered, trying to scare it. It worked. The tiger sat down and watched them. They didn't know whether to run or wait for him to go. Fear won out, and they calmly walked away, and the jaguar didn't follow them. The following day, they brought muskets to find him, but he was gone. Team Morris picked up the poles and fixed their hut. About 3 weeks later, they were hunting on the plain about 4 miles from their home when they saw a lion crouched on the ground watching his prey. The lion was probably a puma. They closed ranks with their muskets ready. Joseph Clinch, with his musket resting on Morris's shoulder, shot it from 20 yards away, but missed. The lion didn't even react. Clinch reloaded the weapon and fired and shot him in the right shoulder. It fell, so they ran up, knocked him in the head with the bones of a dead horse which lay near him. They carried the lion to their hut, dressed his heart and part of his ribs, but it tasted like nothing much. They were surrounded by wild beasts. They were in danger, and now they saw them every time they went out. Apparently, this was the time of year these animals migrated to the coast, so they should embark on an expedition to Buenos Aires a 3rd time. The Bulkeley trio would have starved if the gunner hadn't used his own silver watch and what money he had to support them. He'd arranged it so he would get his money back once they got to Portugal. On September 11, 1742, they weighed anchor on the St. Tubes and sailed off along with a Portuguese man of war and 2 Indiamen. But those outsailed the St. Tubes, and they lost sight of them after 2 days. Whenever the ship braved the storm, the captain would tell them they survived because of their prayers to Nossa Senhora Boa Morte, Our Lady of the Good Death, particularly associated with Bahia. A little over 2 months later, they could see the Rock of Lisbon, the westernmost point of mainland Europe, 25 miles northwest of Lisbon. At 4 p.m., the wind picked up, and by 6 p.m., they were caught in a heavy storm. The foresail split, and the men did their utmost to keep them from running onto shore. Everyone else thought the ship was lost. They fell to their knees and started to pray, crying out to their saints for deliverance, offering all they had in the world for their lives. The English were baffled. Why was no one doing what was needed to save the ship? They should be pumping water out of the hold. Pray on your own time. Bulkeley and Cummins, determined not to be on another wrecked ship, begged the crew to get moving, and the captain and the officers stopped their prayers and whipped everyone up to start pumping. If it hadn't been for the English, the ship would have been wrecked an hour later. Of course, their deliverance was attributed to their patron saint, Our Lady of the Good Death, and they promised to carry the split foresail to the Church of the Saint, where they would make an offering. Some 3 months after the Cheap Three, Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton was brought to Tsakau. He was in a wretched condition, but soon recovered with the good living they had in that town. Then the 4 of them were invited to go on the annual grand tour of the governor for a change of scenery. At all the places he held a court, where the caciques told the governor what had happened since his last visit, and he gave new orders. In Castro, they could plainly see there was no fort nor cannons. One of the caciques who had been kind to the Cheap Four was to be punished for some kind of crime, or because the governor wanted to flex his muscle. The 4 men begged the captain to intercede for them, which he did, after which the governor set him free, telling him he owed it to the Englishman because he was about to make a severe example of him. Byron figured this wasn't a smart move, because now all the Indians knew that Englishmen were kinder than the Spaniards. Byron got a few marriage proposals that he politely declined, and after 3 weeks, everyone returned with the governor to Tsakau. Team Morris had made shoes, jackets, and knapsacks of sealskins to carry their carefully collected food. They went out in 2 parties to secure as much food as possible. 4 went to look for seals, the other 4 would hunt on the plain. Isaac Morris, Samuel Cooper, John Andrews, and John Duck went on a seal hunt. They returned at dusk and saw the dogs coming up to them, acting strangely. Morris figured it was something they caught near the hut, but he was stunned to discover that their hut had been rummaged through. Their stuff was gone. And the midshipmen raced back to the group in a panic. What was wrong? Yonder lie Guy Broadwater and Benjamin Smith, murdered. A most shocking sight. One had his throat cut, and the other was stabbed in the chest. Their bodies weren't cold yet, and the murderers could not be far off. They had no idea what happened to Joseph Clinch and John Allen. This hadn't been done by the men who disappeared, because Broadwater and Smith had been stabbed and cut with knives. Knives they didn't have. Clinch and Allen must have been kidnapped by the Indians. It was odd. They had agreed to fight tooth and nail if they were ever attacked. They had guns at the ready, so at least some attackers should be dead. The 4 survivors now feared for their lives. Still, they went over to investigate and found that everything had been taken away. Our powder, ball, and muskets gone, the fire extinguished, and not the least utensil left. The Morris 4 had no idea what to do or where to go. They reluctantly stayed at the hut, unable to find shelter anywhere else. They would probably starve now, or freeze to death anyway. The following morning, they buried their companions in 2 feet deep graves they dug with their hands, and immediately set out to Buenos Aires a 4th time. The Tsakau governor told the Chief 4 that they'd go to mainland Chile on the ship from Lima that was expected in December. Then, in November, the town of Tsakau erupted with joy when a snow arrived from Lima. This wasn't the annual vessel, but one of the unexpected ones. Her captain, who had a large head, nicknamed Cabuco de Toro, or Bull's Head, refused to come ashore for nearly a week. He finally told the governor that he hadn't slept a wink since he'd arrived. The governor just let 4 English prisoners wander around freely instead of confining them. He figured that at any moment now, they would board his vessel, knock them all out, and sail off. The ship took 30 hands to man. But sure, the governor, trying to keep a straight face, gave his word that such a thing wouldn't happen, but the captain offloaded the cargo as fast as he could and left again. Well, the man wasn't entirely mistaken, because Midshipman Alexander Campbell lamented that if the gunner and the carpenter hadn't sailed south, they could have easily confiscated that snow that carried no cannons nor muskets. Because of Team Bulkeley, they'd been deprived of the opportunity to do a considerable service to Britain. The Morris 4 felt they had no time to lose. They needed to get out before whoever killed their messmates killed them. They tore the raw seal into small pieces and put them in the sealskin knapsacks and filled the seals' bladders with drinking water. They headed out with their 16 dogs and 2 pigs, praying to God to guide them along the coast toward Rio de la Plata, where they'd find a settlement. Morris wrote, "A scheme easy enough in imagination, but in practice attended, as we found, with insuperable difficulties. Along the beach they found cockles and dead fish, which made for good dining. The dogs and pigs feasted on a very large dead whale. They got water out of the hollows in the hills, which had recently filled up with rainwater. After 10 days they ran into small rivers and swamps, which they swam across, and then spent a night being devoured by mosquitoes. After several attempts, they couldn't go further. The bogs were so deep that they nearly suffocated a few times. So in the end, we found we had no remedy left but to tread back the Melancholy Path and return to our old place of rendezvous, which we performed in less than 10 days. On their return, they couldn't venture out far. They had no more weapons to defend themselves from the wild beasts and even wilder men. The Morris 4 ended up killing their pigs and then had to eat some of their trusty dogs, but having no ability to make a fire, eating the raw food made them sick." Team Anson was in trouble. Those who were healthy now started to fall ill. A hole in the Centurion was discovered in the gunner's fore storeroom and could only be fixed from the outside, but they did the best they could from the inside. On August 23rd, they arrived at the Ladrone Islands. They expected to die from scurvy, from getting wrecked, or because there weren't enough hands to pump the Centurion's hold. Then a proa came toward them. They could be Spaniards. They raised the Spanish flag to make her look like the Manilla Galleon and loaded all the guns with grapnel. They easily captured those on the proa. A Spanish sergeant from Guam and 4 Indians, who were definitely fooled into believing the Centurion was the Manilla Galleon. They made berth at Tinian Island, a little paradise for the Centurionites. There were plenty of water, cattle, hogs, poultry, oranges, limes, lemons, and coconuts on the uninhabited island. They took possession of the place. There were plenty of huts, so they didn't waste time erecting tents. 128 sick were brought on land. The relief was immense, but short-lived. During a storm, the Commodore, who'd also come down with scurvy, and a large part of the crew were ashore, 113 in all. 10 days later, they watched the Centurion break loose from the anchors and disappear. While she fired guns in distress, the thunder and lightning obscured the sound and sight, and those on shore were stuck. Some believed the ship had sunk, and even if she hadn't, there weren't enough men on board to man her and bring her back. They were 1,800 miles from Macau, the nearest port, and they only had the Spanish bark, which could hold not even a quarter of them. Team Anson had no hope of a European ship showing up, since they were likely the first large ship to land there. They would either die on this island, or if the governor of Guam found out about them, they'd be imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Either way, they'd never see England again. But with their commissions on board the Centurion, they might be labeled pirates and dance the hempen jig, that is, hanged. Commodore Anson wouldn't hear of such doom talk. First, there was no way the Centurion was lost, and second, he had a plan. They would saw the bark in half, lengthen her, and carry them all to China to be reunited with the Centurion. All hands, including the Commodore and the officers, had to help the 2 carpenters who'd luckily brought their chest of tools or else gather victuals for the journey. The smith was also ashore and had brought a forge and some tools. They made bellows from scratch with hides and a gun barrel. They found a small compass in the bark and they found a quadrant washed up ashore. They expected to put to sea on November 5th. But on October 11th, a seaman on a hill saw sail. It was the Centurion. Huzzah! 10 days later, they set sail for Macau in China on their ship. On November 28, 1742, the Bulkeley trio arrived in Lisbon, Portugal. The following morning, everyone on the ship, except for the carpenter, the gunner, and the cooper, walked barefoot in the biting cold, carrying the St. Tubes' foresail in a procession a mile to the church of Nossa Senhora Boa Morte. The Englishmen went to the English trading house where they got a pretty cool reception, as in, they knew all about Gunner Bulkeley, the chief mutineer of the Wager. Lieutenant Baines had arrived before them and had just left for England. He had nothing good to say about any of them. The merchants advised the men not to return to England, lest they should suffer death for mutiny. Bulkeley knew some of these merchants personally and told them that Baines hadn't kept a daily journal with an impartial account, but he had. Here, read it. Several merchants did and were satisfied to see that if there was any case for mutiny, Baines was the chief mutineer. The trio, confident of their innocence, wanted to go home no matter what. They had acted for the preservation of their lives and liberties and would clear themselves of all resentful reflections and hateful accusations. On December 20th, the Bulkeley trio embarked on His Majesty's ship the Stirling Castle for England. They could appreciate her cleanliness, accommodation, diet, and discipline. The journey was uneventful, and on January 1st, 1743, they arrived at Spithead. The trio looked forward to the embrace of their families and friends, but the captain told them to stay put. They were prisoners pending a court-martial. Lieutenant Baines and Boatswain John King, who'd also arrived a little earlier with 13 men, made some serious allegations before the Board of Inquiry. The trio was bummed. In view of their homes, their troubles were still not over. 2 weeks after the Bulkeley trio's arrival, what felt like a year, the Lords of the Admiralty let them go, pending further investigations before the Board of Inquiry. They quickly thanked everyone on board and got off the ship to race home, which they hadn't seen in 2 years and 6 months. The rest of Team Bulkeley, who'd been left in Brazil, arrived soon after, but the Cheap Four and the Morris Four were still trying to make it to England, and Team Anson was still planning to capture that Manilla Galleon. But that's for the next and final episode, The Ghost of Wager Island. Until then.